All right, thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and thank you for filling out our poll, just as a nice little warm-up. Apparently 40% of our participants are wearing sneakers right now, about 19% are wearing flip-flops, and this is of course for folks who are actually wearing shoes today when they connected, because I'm sure we have a few bare feet out there. So with that, I'd like to get started. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Conservation and Living Marine Resource Management in the Face of a Changing Climate. I'm Jessica Coakley with the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and on behalf of myself, my co-organizer, Megan Tremmel with Linker at the NOAA Office for Coastal Management, and the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, we are delighted to have you join us today. We have an excellent session lined up. We do have some online instructions that Carl Villacova will provide for our attendees.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. A couple of quick tech notes. This session will be hosted on GoToWebinar. By default, all attendees are in listen-only mode. So please type all questions, comments, and messages into the questions/chat pane that you see in your control panel. The organizer may also share information such as links and other messages with attendees from the questions and chat pane. The link to today's webinar will be active all day, so if you have to leave and want to come back later for the closing plenary, the same link will work for that. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Carl. So we have all been spending a tremendous amount of time online, staring at people's faces on video calls for over a year. And while you can learn a lot by looking at someone's face, you can also learn a lot about them from their shoes. So thanks for sharing with us this morning what shoes you're wearing. We've also asked our panelists to tell us a bit about their favorite shoes to help us learn a little bit more about them. So climate change is rapidly warming our ocean and altering our ocean environment. From the bottom of the food chain up, species habitats and their habitat use are impacted. The big question is, how can we effectively plan for ocean use while conserving and protecting the ecosystem resources that are a highly valued part of the Mid-Atlantic marine environment? During this session, you'll learn about ongoing work designed to help managers understand the changes the species are experiencing in the marine environment, along with their implications for management. And we'll also explore how ocean mapping tools and other data tools can support more effective planning and management for these resources. We've broken the session into 3 parts. The first 2 parts will each have 3 presentations with about 15 minutes for discussion and questions. For part 3, it's actually very, very early in the morning in Australia. So for our international perspective, we've received a video contribution on managing for climate resilience in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and that'll be presented by Dr. David Wachenfeld. So for our first speaker, that would be Caleb Spiegel. Caleb is a marine bird biologist in the Migratory Bird Program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Caleb, please tell us about why these are your favorite pair of shoes on your title slide, and begin your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Just wanting to, okay, I see the share button. Can you see my my slides, Jessica?
I can. Go ahead and get started.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jessica and Megan, for inviting me to talk at this session, and to the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean for having this great meeting of the minds and people learning more about oceans and the issues that are affecting oceans. Well, so I really did appreciate the shoe exercise, because it gives me a chance to highlight my vintage, I think 15, maybe 20-year-old Chacos. I got them before the Chacos started going downhill on construction, and these are still doing really well. They've been to a lot of parts of the country and internationally, seen a lot of nesting beaches, and now you can see really a lot of, I've gone from monitoring bird eggs to plastic eggs. I had 6 years ago, I had my first child, my wife and I, and now I have two. So I spent a lot of time in the sandbox, and that's what you're seeing there. But I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about a little bit more about seabirds and what we do in the migratory bird program of the Fish and Wildlife Service. I work in our North Atlantic Appalachian region, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that. So seabirds, as I'm sure many of you know, most seabirds migrate very long distances over oceans, and they're among the longest migration of any animal worldwide. An example of this is the Arctic tern that goes from breeding grounds in the Arctic down to the Antarctic and then returns every year. So that's an exceptional migration, and particularly over the ocean, which they depend on. And a lot of these species also forage for fish, the majority fish or invertebrates. And so you have a gannet here showing a characteristic dive and catching a fish. Most are also a member of 4 different orders, and then sometimes 3 other orders as well, but that includes albatrosses, petrels and shearwaters, gannets, frigatebirds and cormorants, the penguins, of course, terns, gulls and alcids, and sometimes people consider pelicans, loons and sea ducks as seabirds, and we are doing that here in this talk. Seabirds are very good indicators of long-term and large-scale change in ecosystems, and that's because they occupy these high trophic levels. They're really long-lived. They have a very wide range worldwide. They're pretty cosmopolitan, and they occupy a lot of niches, and they tend to be vulnerable to a lot of the things that affect the other marine organisms. So they're thought to be a really good indicator. And the news for birds is not great. And I think you probably have hopefully heard about this paper in Science by Rosenberg et al. From 2019 that showed that in North America, 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970. Now, that particular study focused primarily on land birds, but the picture for seabirds is not any better. In fact, in some ways, it's worse. We've seen 70% of seabirds worldwide declining since 1950. And in North America, over half of the 119 species that use our waters are considered birds of conservation concern or listed in the Endangered Species Act. And the challenges that they face are pretty similar to a lot of things that marine organisms are facing. That includes marine debris, particularly plastic is of real interest lately, pollution, fisheries issues like forage fish depletion and bycatch mortality, nesting habitat degradation, such as introduced species and debris on the beaches and on the nesting colonies. Energy development, which includes offshore wind development now, is really getting big on the Atlantic, but also things like oil and natural gas. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is climate change. That has the capacity to really have huge impacts on species, and it also worsens these other threats, such as forage fish depletion. And so that makes the competition in fisheries even worse. In the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Program, our mission is leadership in migratory bird conservation and management through effective partnerships, applied science, and innovative strategies. Now, I highlight partnerships because we're a pretty small program, and compared to some of our partners, we really don't have the resources that we need to conduct everything on our own. So partnerships are key, and what we really do in migratory birds is we pull partners together to get work done. Our responsibilities include the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, NEPA consultation. We also support regulation of Endangered Species Act listed birds. And we're a member of international treaties, agreements, and working groups, such as the Arctic Council's Conservation of Arctic Fauna and Flora Working Group. And there are 12 Department of Interior regions, and 9 of those regions have a tie to the ocean in some shape or form. So I'm going to give you the quick 5-minute tour or so of a lot of the work that we're working on, but I do want to mention that when I can, I'm going to highlight the work that's in the Atlantic, but I did want to give a broader overview as well. So I'll be talking about throughout our entire Fish and Wildlife Service program, but a lot of this will be focused on the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. So in the Atlantic, very little work has been done with regard to seabirds and marine debris. We know that there are impacts, but we don't know what the degree of those impacts are. And so in 2019, the NOAA Marine Debris Program organized a group, which included Fish and Wildlife Service staff, to develop the Gulf of Maine Marine Debris Action Plan. And through that planning exercise, we initiated a program, a project to really pull information together in one place to fill gaps on how seabirds are affected by marine debris and to pull partners together to develop strategies on how to deal with those. And we have right now an implementation framework is being developed, which will hopefully lead partners in that direction to make some progress on that. We also have been involved in the Deepwater Horizon NERDA project. And what this is we're advising the Open Oceans Trustees Implementation Group on how to most effectively restore the bird resource that was injured in the spill. And there is actually currently a request for project ideas that is open on the trustees website until May 10th. So if you have any interest, particularly in birds, because this next plan is supposed to really focus on birds, go check that out. There's a lot of work being done here with fisheries, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. We've worked with the fisheries management councils to better incorporate birds into ecosystem-based management. A big example of that was the herring amendment, the amendment number 8, which recently was approved, and then chub mackerel in the Mid-Atlantic. We've helped advise NIMS and the councils on birds. We also have been working with partners to serve bird data a little bit better into NOAA products that are informing fisheries, like ecosystem indices and the NIMS State of the Ecosystem reports. And we also have been helping out when we can on incorporating bird information into different kinds of papers and publications on forage resources like sand lance. There's a big paper that came out in 2020 by Staudinger et al. In Fish and Fisheries that is worth checking out that talks about sand lance, and birds are a big part of that. Marine bird bycatch is another area where we're working with the management councils throughout the country and also state agencies to try and provide some information that would help meet Endangered Species Act and Migratory Bird Treaty Act requirements. Part of this is to collect and provide data, but we also are interested in outreach and mitigation techniques that we can serve. In the Atlantic, some of these examples include a business plan and gear research. And there's this business plan that we put together in 2012 to help guide some efforts of partners. And that helped lead to a gillnet workshop organized by American Bird Conservancy and Royal Society and others in 2015 to get some information, a little bit more information about gillnets and how they affect birds. And that also has led to pilot deterrent research, trying to figure out how to use alternative gear, both visual and acoustic. So we're in the sort of pilot stage of that, but we're working on it with partners. We've also worked with NIMS for a long while and for guidance of commercial fisheries. And we've put together a pamphlet on that to help guide fisheries. A lot of work has been done with energy development. We have put together the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog, which has aggregated 700,000 observations taken between 1906 and 2017. We've also put in a lot of tracking research, and this is all leading to data products that can help with NEPA consultation on collision and displacement risk and impact. And I should mention there's a real link here to the oceans portals, Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, which I think have been talked about during this session. Currently, we're working to improve collision risk models and pre and post construction. We're doing a lot of monitoring for things like albatross, petrels. We are pulling that information in these big catalogs that are really helping to inform management needs. One of the things in Mexico and the Atlantic are these big seabird surveys that have taken place since 2011 called the Marine Assessment Program for Protected Species. So we've been monitoring seabirds at sea and also in boats with that. Climate change is a big issue in Alaska, where in the Arctic we're seeing the effects more early, and that includes at-sea surveys over 20,000 kilometers per year, and it's really informing things like understanding these big die-offs and disease monitoring that we're seeing in the Bering and Chukchi seas, and then also this new issue that's arising is Arctic vessel traffic. As ice is melting, we're actually having a lot more conflict with birds and these vessels that are now using Arctic waters. I want to...
Caleb, we'll need you to start wrapping up. Thank you.
Okay, yep, yeah. And so I'm going to actually skip right now to a way that you can get involved through the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative. So please go to atlanticmarinebirds.org. It's a partner-driven group of around 200 managers and scientists. We work collaboratively with people like you to try and figure out how to address research and management needs. We've really come up with a lot of different group accomplishments, which you can read about more on our website. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about our program. Thank you, Jessica.
Hi, Caleb. Thank you so much. We really appreciate having you here to present. And I'm sorry, time-wise, we've got to keep things moving, but we will have an opportunity for questions after we finish all three of our presentations. We'll have some time for questions. So our next presenter is going to be Dr. Peter Corcoran. Peter leads the whale research team at the Krause Marine Mammal Conservation Program of the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life with the New England Aquarium. Peter, please tell us about why these are your favorite pair of shoes and start your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much. And my apologies for this being such a kludgy way of doing this, but folks, I use Linux and it seems that GoToMeeting doesn't play very well with it. But anyway, we'll struggle through. And yeah, this is a pair of old Blundstone boots of mine, and I've been wearing Blunnies for a very long time because they're work boots from Australia. And they're proof of one of the adages that, if you wear something long enough, they become fashionable. And yeah, so anyway, so that's why I put the Blunnies up there. And so, could you move? I'm just going to flick through the slides here, but I better tell you to do that. Can we have the next slide, please? And you'll see, hopefully you'll be seeing a picture of a Rottweiler and a right whale. And apparently I have an accent, and this is to point out that I'm talking about right whales, not Rottweilers. Next slide, please. And hopefully this is the Received Wisdom 1. Is that correct? Okay.
It is.
So,
yep, Wisdom 1.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is just give, I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to give brief background on what the story is with right whales and what this means for the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Council as I can see it. So what we know about North Atlantic right whales, they've been in decline for about a decade now. They maxed out at a bit under 500. They're now down at about 360. And there is 3 males for every 2 females now. So if you think about it, they've lost 25% of the species in the past decade. We know with certainty that the reason they're dying is because of things people are doing. We know this is due to entanglements and vessel strikes. We also know that entanglements are more important than the whales that we find dead would suggest. And we also know that vessel strikes by vessels under 65 feet. At the moment, there are rules in place for vessels over 65 feet. We know that boats under 65 feet can be a problem for right whales as well. So moving on to what we know next. Have the next slide, please. And this is just showing the abundance of right whales over the past, since 1990. And this is from the most recent right whale report card that the Right Whale Consortium puts out. And you can ignore the top 2 lines. The bottom 2 lines are the ones that matters. The light blue line is a mark recapture model developed, led by Richard Pace from Northeast Fisheries Science Centre. That's our best estimate of how many North Atlantic right whales there are, and you can see the pattern of their decline since 2010 or so. And next slide, please. Okay. So what else do we know? What else is there in our received wisdom? We know there's been poor calving as well for the past decade, not just the abundance, not just that whales are dying. And we're also seeing an increase in the age at sexual maturity. North Atlantic right whales tend to mature at 8 or 9 or 10. And this year, there were 5 females that gave birth for the first time, and their ages ranged between 12 and 19. What we don't understand with both the poor calving is in right whales are meant to have calves about every 3 years, maybe every 4. At the moment, it's more like somewhere between 5 to 7 to 9 years that they're having calves. What we don't know is whether this calving is due to they're not finding enough food, or whether the energetic cost of being entangled is such that's affecting females' capacity to have calves. And it could be both of those. We also know that right whales have changed their distribution since 2010. We've seen an overlap with snow crab fishery and shipping in the Gulf St. Lawrence, which has contributed to the mortalities that we've seen. We're seeing more foraging now in the Mid-Atlantic region, and I should note that some of that is right whales simply reusing what we know is their historical range if we look at the records going back centuries. And to some extent, what's happening sort of south of Cape Cod, how much of that is distributional change and how much of that is for sure noticing what's going on is a bit of a moot point, although past acoustic data suggests that the movement south is real. Next slide, please. This should be received wisdom number 3. So the take-home message with, you know, what the story is that it seems like the way we view right whales changed in 2017. That was when we found out they were in decline and when there was a whole stack of deaths in the Gulf St. Lawrence that alerted people to the problem there. And the final bit of received wisdom that I want to raise and then start questioning the received wisdom is the relationship between climate-driven changes in Calanus distribution and right whales distribution. And there's work that's been published. Everything I've said so far is backed up by referee publications. And there's referee publications demonstrating that, you know, there's good reason to think that there's this relationship between Calanus moving and the right whales following it. A problem with that is that we have seen this movement of right whales south as well as north, and that seems unlikely to be due to in response to Calanus and Marchicus. Another problem with this is we don't really understand how whales find and return to foraging locations. Whales are memory-driven foragers, and they're culturally driven as well. A question that goes begging is if there's not enough food for less than 400 North Atlantic right whales, and they feed on Calanus Marchicus, and Calanus Marchicus is, you know, the base of so much of the system here, what's this telling us about the system? Which is a bit of an open question. And another point, another caveat to this is work Jen Davis from the Northeast Fisheries Science Centre published very recently has demonstrated using past acoustic data that 3 other large whale species that don't feed on Calanus, baleen whales, have also changed their distribution in a pattern very similar to North Atlantic right whales. So, you know, there are some caveats to our received wisdom. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about, you know, what goes against the received wisdom. First off, the known and detected deaths. So detected deaths tell us how many whales, a minimum number of whales that must have died. It doesn't tell us how many whales died. And the number of detected deaths has always been over the potential biological removal limit, right? And that's supposed to have been remedied back in 1997. And the problem with that is that it goes against the story that was being told inside NARW fisheries through to 2017. The right whales were a conservation success because there were still problems. And from some work that we published in 2018, we've shown that in fact, recovery of North Atlantic right whales post-whaling has been inhibited by anthropogenic mortality. It's just never, recovery was never as good as it could have been or should have been. We also know that North Atlantic right whales were in trouble before 2017. There was a paper by a lot of the leading lights of right whale science put out in 2016 that raised the flag that we had things to be concerned about. We also knew from Richard Pace's model, we had model outputs from that by early 2016. We knew something had gone wrong earlier, right? We had at least a year and a half warning that something had gone wrong. And the other point about, the Gulf of Lawrence is we actually found that aggregation back in 2015, but no one paid much attention to it until all the whales turned up dead in 2017. Next slide, please. So this should now be cultural lessons. I guess because this is an Ocean Council conversation, that's why I've pitched it this way. But, let's remember that fisheries science is a subset of marine environmental science. And fisheries science culture is strongly oriented towards model-based inference. And there's a focus more on biological oceanography than behavioral ecology, as opposed to, say, something like conservation biology, where behavioral ecology is seen as having more of a role. And given the way whales behave, I think this is a problem that we face. And one of the things that, coming from somewhere where we knew a lot less about whales than people do here, I always thought working on right whales was kind of cheating here, because we know so much about them. And one of the problems with that, though, is we then have this assumption that we really do know what's going on. And we understand not only status, we understand process. And the final point about fisheries science culture that I'll raise is that, because so much of fisheries is oriented towards maximizing commercial fisheries, you can end up managing along a knife edge. And when that sort of attitude flows into endangered species management, you end up in trouble, which is where we are now with right whales. And the other thing I point out, because I used to work inside NOAA fisheries and have left there, is that there are some issues about how the culture of conformity within fisheries is played out with the science, and has worked against doing a better job of getting the science out as soon as possible. And given that there was this belief that right whales are a success story, it was very hard to push against that inside NOAA. Next slide, please. This should be right whales, the lessons. Is that right? So I think for me, the big point to bring home is that the impacts of climate disruption are here right now. We've been living with a problem with North Atlantic right whales that's a climate disruption driven problem already. It's not a future problem, it's here. Another issue is that we've never managed this for resilience. We've always managed to be doing sort of okay. And what we don't have is enough right whales that when something goes wrong, we have a disaster rather than a problem we need to address. And so, North Atlantic right whales are really an example of a conservation failure in response to climate disruption. It's had huge public attention. There are species for which the science is excellent and is well resourced, and there's lots of people doing excellent work on North Atlantic right whales. We've had a decline now for 10 years. We've known about it for at least 5. We've lost a quarter of the species, and the decline's continuing. And at the moment, there's not much happening on the water in this country, and we're certainly lagging Canada. And I guess one thing that this raises is, just as, the physical infrastructure of how we support transportation is going to be significantly overhauled in response to dealing with climate disruption, I suggest that, in fact, there's an intellectual infrastructure problem that we need to address here to come up with a better management culture so that we can move faster in the face of climate disruption. And with that, I'll say thank you to all the supporters of the aquarium's research, the research team, all the members of North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium who contribute so wonderfully to know what we do about this species. And thank you so much for resolving these last-minute computer glitches. And that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your presentation and thoughts. We'll be taking questions after our last presentation, which will be provided by Dr. Malin Pinsky. Malin is an associate professor for the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources at Rutgers University, a program very near and dear to my heart because my bachelor's degree did come through that program. So Malin, if you would just tell us why these are your favorite pair of shoes and start your presentation.
Good morning, and thank you to Jessica and Megan for organizing this session about shoes. It's been wonderful to hear from Caleb and Peter, and I'm also looking forward to hearing the other speakers later this morning. I'm going to talk specifically about a pair of boots today, a pair of hiking boots you can see here. And there's three main reasons I chose these. One, they help me get out and explore remote areas, including at least at some moments for weeks at a time. It's been a lot of fun. They're especially helpful in rocky and especially interesting terrain. And they're made of leather and other materials that are pretty easy to repair. I replaced the sole already, and they've already lasted 22 years. I expect they'll last at least that long again. But I guess you want me to talk about some other things as well. So the rest of my talk is going to be about ocean planning for species on the move. And I want to start by mentioning my co-authors on this project, Lauren Rogers, a fisheries scientist from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, Jim Morley, a marine ecologist from East Carolina University, and Thomas Furlicker, a climate scientist from the University of Bern in Switzerland. So as many at this conference are familiar with, the coastal ocean has rapidly become a busy place with many different human activities, including wind, energy development, fishing, as well as areas set aside for conservation. And this map is just an example from the Mid-Atlantic Regional Ocean Action Plan, identifying areas planned for renewable energy, others protected for whales, matching up with Peter's talk, others used by fishing or transited by ships. And some of these areas are static and unlikely to move for decades or even longer, while other areas are much more flexible as human activity changes. So wind energy, for example, can be designed in part to avoid conflict with fisheries or conservation goals. And that's often done right now based on where fisheries and conservation priority areas are now. But what I want to argue today is that I don't think this is enough. So ocean planning efforts typically use the geographic distribution of species as an input to planning. Species distributions obviously also strongly influence the distribution of fishing effort as well. And this map shows in red areas of high black sea bass density in the Northeast US in the early 1970s, one of many species on the East Coast. But thanks to ecosystems that many marine species, in this case from the we know are moving as ocean temperatures and oxygen concentrations change. And in the Northeast US, for example, we've seen a sharp northward shift in black sea bass distribution illustrated here. It matches well to warming temperatures and changing oxygen in the region. We've seen this across many different species in the region. If we start to look forward into the future, we find that species may move up to 1,000 kilometers more by the end of this century. And the red arrows in this map show how much more species are likely to shift in each region by 2100 under a high greenhouse gas emission scenario. And then the blue arrows, I should say, indicate how much farther we expect them to shift, even under a low greenhouse gas emission scenario. In this case, RCP 4.5 or 2.6 actually in this one. So these changes in species distributions that are already occurring are challenging fisheries management, challenging conservation efforts, and I think they're also likely to cause challenges for ocean planning more broadly going forward. For anyone who wants to explore both historical and projected future shifts in marine species, I encourage you to check out Ocean Adapt. It's a website we've developed in partnership with NOAA Fisheries, as well as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. It has data and maps through time for a wide range of primarily demersal species, including the Northeast US, but actually all over North America. For today's talk, though, I want to focus on a few questions. First, is static planning, sort of setting aside specific areas of the ocean, is that kind of ocean planning sensitive to species on the move? Can static planning be adapted to species redistributions? And if we do try to adapt static planning to these kinds of redistributions, are there strong trade-offs between planning for where species are now versus planning for where they may be in the future? So the approach we've taken is to basically simulate a toy version of the ocean planning process. We set goals for a plan, like setting aside areas for fishing based on where important commercial species are found, setting aside conservation areas to capture a wide diversity of species, and also setting aside areas for wind, or including for some of the other regions in North America, wave development based on where high net present value of these energy sources are likely to be. And so given maps on where these resources are now, we can solve that planning problem with a software called Prioritizer. And it makes a plan that works well for the present distribution of these resources. We use quarter-degree grid cells as our planning units in what I'll show you next. I will say this is really meant as a cartoon of the process, just sort of a proof of concept. Obviously misses a lot of important steps in an actual ocean planning conducted in the real world. But the idea is that we end up with a map that might propose setting aside areas for fishing, for conservation, for energy development. Obviously, don't look too hard at this map. It's just a cartoon of the process. But the idea is if we have a map, we can then test that plan against projections of where species may be in the future. And in this kind of exercise, we're evaluating goals for fishing areas and for conservation areas in particular, asking whether areas set aside for fishing still include high biomass of important fishery species, and whether conservation areas still include a wide diversity of species, despite future shifts in distribution. And we do this not just for one potential future, but because we know there's a lot of uncertainty in the future, but for a wide range of potential futures based on 16 different combinations of greenhouse gas emission scenarios and global climate models. What we see is that a plan built around where species are now will be less likely to meet planning goals in the future. And this graph shows that decline. We've got year across the x-axis and the fraction of fishing and conservation goals met on the y-axis. This is for the Northeast US, but we see that similarly when we've done similar exercises in other regions of North America. Very congruent patterns. So what if we step back and actually try to make a more consciously proactive plan, one that considers not just where species are now, but also where species may be in the future? So we can do that species at the end of the century. I will note that the projections we use for this planning is separate from the projections we use for testing the plans, just so that we avoid circularity. But again, we solve that planning problem. So the goal is to find areas that are good for fishing now and in the future, good for conservation now and in the future, and other areas that are good for wind energy or wave energy. The first point is that planning with both current and future species distributions in mind does create quite different plans. This graph shows that about 20% of these proactive plans are different compared to a present-only plan. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of planning units that have switched when we went from this present-only to this proactive planning. Each of the 9 regions is across this x-axis. And the plans are primarily different because they're set up much more like beads on a chain, so that species might move out of one fishing area further south, but into another one further north, and similarly for conservation areas. And the energy development areas are oriented around some of those priority areas as well. Though one of the concerns, though, is that a plan that tries to do this is going to restrict activity in a much larger area of the ocean. We've effectively doubled the number of goals in this planning that this planning algorithm is trying to meet. However, that's not what we see. And this bar plot shows the fraction of the planning zones in conservation at the bottom, fishing in a slightly lighter color, energy development above that, and then proactive plan. Not zoned at all up at the top, present only, in warm colors, cool, the proactive plans in the cool colors. See a very slight increase and only a 2% increase on average. Across all regions, we see that these proactive plans in these purple lines are consistently better at meeting ocean planning goals through time. Not only far into the future, but also much just over the next couple decades because of climate variability and uncertainty in where species may be over even short time frames. So it suggests that planning for long-term change also has short-term benefits. So in summary, populations are shifting rapidly as ocean temperatures and climates change. We can evaluate ocean plans to identify conflicts with species on the move. We can also consider future species distributions to avoid conflicts from the start, starting right now. And I think more broadly, planning for the future doesn't conflict with planning for the present. I think that's a very important point. Lots of folks to thank, including Lauren Rogers, Jim Morley, and Thomas Furlicker, my collaborators on this, the organizations that have supported this work, and thanks to all of you. Also, I should also say, just to wrap up, I'm actively looking for partners interested in working on these issues and trying to implement these kinds of approaches. So please get in touch if you're interested. Got contact information there.
Great. Thank you so much, Malin. And I'd like to thank Peter Corcoran, Caleb Spiegel, and Malin Pinsky all for your excellent presentations. I want to remind our attendees, if they have questions, they can pop those into the chat box. So those will be available to us. But while we have the three of you on the line, I'd like to get us started with a question I have. What do you think some of the greatest challenges are in terms of the uptake of this information on changes in species distributions and changes in ocean use by resource managers? So taking this information and essentially making it actionable in terms of supporting resource management decisions. So I'll throw it out there to either Malin, Caleb, or Peter, either if any of you would like to jump in.
And Caleb, you're welcome to turn back on your camera if you're still there.
Maybe I can take a first shot and then others can jump in. I think part of it is, I think that I see two challenges. One is just getting the information, making the information more accessible. You know, I think it's been largely in the academic world, and trying to find ways to make these kinds of changes much more visible and easy to use, easy to incorporate into planning. We sort of have many of the ocean planning resources sort of view the ocean as a static map or as really dynamic over the short term, but we don't sort of have this intermediate scale looking at changes over decades very readily available. And I think there's change our mindset to, you know, we're not trying to plan for a specific mindset. We're not trying to plan for a future, but a wide range of potential futures, and identify solutions that are going to work well across a wide range of futures. And that's true for the next decade, which, you know, climate variability is really important, as well as the next century, when there are also some dramatic directional changes that are happening. So at least some initial thoughts.
Caleb or Peter, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna, I think those are all very good points, Malin, and in addition, it's sort of another challenge is trying to make sure that information that's being collected, it's kind of hard sometimes when we're trying to predict future conditions to know what kind of data we're gonna need to fill in those holes. And so making sure that the data are collected in a way that are flexible enough to kind of provide for maybe some things that we're not anticipating right now, but also in a way that I think is, you know, I think standard enough. I don't know if standard is exactly, you know, something where that people could actually take the information and use it in the future. If people are all doing things that are vastly different, it's going to be really hard to kind of make those different pieces of data fit together and work in a way that we can answer these broader questions. And I see that, you know, sometimes even with you know, some of this offshore wind development stuff, where we have a lot of people doing a lot of different things. And what we really need is I think, to have some more consistency and you know, be asking the big questions right off the bat, so that we can actually be collecting the right kind of data.
Great, thank you. All good points. Peter, if you're still on the line, you're welcome to follow up to that question. But I also have a specific question directed to your talk, what should we be doing to better manage North Atlantic right whales? So you're welcome to follow up on both of those questions.
Well, thanks, because I think this gets to answering the previous question as well, and just building on what's been said already. I think, I mean, the big problem with managing how we're dealing with North Atlantic right whales drift to extinction is that we need to have a good hard look at how we've ended up in this situation. And, we have lots of data. We know a lot about this, and we're still in this mess. And it seems to me that, that's going to require organizations having a very hard, very difficult look at themselves, and also recognition that, we're going to get things wrong. We have terrific data and really bright people working on it, but, we're not omnipotent. We don't know everything. We don't understand a lot of these processes. And that being so, how do we build in buffers? How do we ensure that we have enough insurance in place that we don't end up with another right whale story happening next week? And that's going to be a significant change, I think, in how the baseline of how managers operate. And some of that requires, what do we care most about, and asking that question in the first place, and then how do we get to what we care about? Hopefully that's not too broad answer.
No, thank you. We've got another question, and I think this is more towards either Caleb or Peter. Are there emerging or innovative technologies that have further developed show promise for reducing strikes or other harmful impacts to wildlife that are utilizing the same space as offshore wind, navigation, other ocean uses? Do you want to tackle that one first, Caleb?
Yeah, sure. Well, with regard to, obviously, trying to understand bird collision mortality in the offshore environment is really a challenge. That said, there have been a lot of efforts underway to try and mix different technologies that include things like, radar technology with cameras, with different types of nanotag tracking, and I think a mix of those technologies together is really kind of what people have been looking towards, at least for birds and bats. And so, there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. We probably would have found it by now. Because there have been a lot of people thinking about it. But I think as we get further along, we're going to start to see that these mixes of technology in innovative ways are essentially occurring with regard to birds. And then another real important question, I think, with regard to birds is just displacement and understanding how displacement is affecting, birds, particularly at different build-out scenarios. That's maybe even a more challenging question to understand. But through some of these tracking information and some creative ways for doing pre and post construction survey monitoring, you can start to get at those questions and identify at least what is occurring, if not how it's affecting the population.
And to answer that one for whales, I mean, at one level it's really simple. We know it works. You slow boats down to 10 knots when whales are around, and that's a very good solution. The issue becomes when whales are around. For that, we have passive acoustics tools that are showing, enormous value in knowing when whales, letting people know when whales are around. Moving beyond that, it becomes a bit like the logic of slowing down to 20 miles an hour in a school zone. You can have all the technology in the world around a car. We have lane moving and rear view cameras and all the rest now. We still slow down to 20 miles an hour in a school zone because no one wants to hit a kid. And it's the same mindset there. It's really simple. You slow down, and that resolves most of the problems with vessel strike.
All right. Well, thank you, Malin, Caleb, and Peter. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us online today, and hope you'll stick around for the remainder of the presentations. With that, I'm going to hand this off to Megan, who will introduce our speakers for the second round of presentations.
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Thanks, Jessica, and thanks so much to the first panel for the great presentations. We're gonna shift our focus just a bit now and talk about how aggregating data and information into some synthesis products and tools can help to inform ocean planning. So we have 3 excellent speakers lined up. We're gonna start with Sarah Gatius. Sarah is a research fisheries biologist with NOAA's Northeast Fisheries Science Center. She's going to talk to us today about their integrated ecosystem assessments and about their state of the ecosystem reporting products. So Sarah, let's hear about your favorite shoes, and then you can go ahead and dive in.
Okay, thank you. And I'm assuming you're seeing my screen and seeing the presentation? Okay, and can hear me.
Yeah,
excellent. If I have audio problems, I'm going to turn off my camera, so I'll just tell you that in advance. And thank you for inviting me today, and thank you for this whole shoe thing that we're doing. It's really kind of fun. So the shoes you're seeing here are shoes that I bought when I was on an international fellowship in Bergen, Norway. And so I traveled there for 2 months, and I knew that Bergen was a city, and I didn't bother bringing my big heavy hiking boots that I would have loved to have had once I arrived and found that Bergen's surrounded by 7 mountains that you can just walk right up out of the city and be in the wilderness. So while I was there, I bought these not great hiking shoes, but they really served me well. They got me out into the mountains. I got to see a lot of cool things with my family. And so to me, what these represent, as broken down as they are now, having lasted only 2 years, is that sometimes we make the best of the resources we've got, and it helps us achieve our goals. And we can always get out there and do a little better next time, but it's important to get out there in the first place. So with that, I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this, Kim Bastille, Garrett DePiper, Kim Hyde, Scott Large, and Sean Lucy, and the many, many contributors to our State of the Ecosystem report that you'll be seeing results from today. So integrated ecosystem assessment is a process. And so what it is over here on this right-hand side of the slide is represented the process where it's basically a decision support tool, right? And so the first thing you do is you define your goals. What is it we're trying to achieve? What do we care about, as we just heard from Peter? And then you develop indicators that help you understand how you're doing against those goals. And so that's the next step here. From the indicators, you can assess the ecosystem, analyze uncertainty and risk, evaluate strategies to help you achieve your goals better, implement management actions, monitor those indicators, do another assessment, evaluate and assess outcomes, go back and maybe rethink some of your goals and targets and develop more indicators, etc. So it's a process. What I'm going to talk to you today about is how the process is being implemented, and one of the tools we're using is the State of the Ecosystem Report, or SOE. So you'll see a lot of acronyms because I do work for the government. And the idea here is to improve this information and synthesis for fishery managers. And so the ecosystem indicators in the report are directly linked to management objectives, just like here in these first 2 steps. It is contextual information right now. The report's been evolving since about 2016, and it is a fishery relevant subset of what might be considered a full ecosystem status report. So we're not trying to report on everything. We are trying to be very focused on fishery management objectives, and it would be a different report if there were different objectives. But we do have an open science emphasis, and it is used within the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council's ecosystem process, which I'll talk about in a moment. So everyone can have access to these slides, and anything that's highlighted in red here is a link that you can see some of the papers, so you can go back and see those later. So the Mid-Atlantic Council's ecosystem approach has been developed over the course of about the last decade, and the policy guidance document is linked right there. But at the heart of it, the ecosystem approach to fishery management, EAFM framework, is sort of an adaptation of integrated ecosystem assessment. So the first step is prioritizing. What do you want to do? And to do that, you look at a risk assessment. That's one way of doing it, and it's what the council's chosen to do. So a risk assessment can tell you where are some of your highest risk interactions in this system that you're not already dealing with. And then from that risk assessment, after prioritizing, the next step is to refine. To refine, you need to understand what question it is you really want to ask. You can build a conceptual model that links across all of these different risks and brings in the interactions that maybe the previous council process wasn't able to address, and asks what's the key question and what information is necessary to address this question. So you're not quantitative yet, but you are qualitative, and you're trying to get the big picture of what you're seeing around your key question. Then the third step is analysis, more quantitative management strategy evaluation, to determine which of those strategies perform best. So you're down towards the end of the IA loop and going into what you might want to implement or monitor after that analysis. And then with the council's process, you can loop back through to any of these other steps. Okay, and so where does the state of the ecosystem report fit in? Well, it has been reported for the last few years, and this year we've updated the structure to really focus in on some of these ecosystem scale fishery management objectives that you're seeing over here on the right-hand side. And so these have to do with seafood production, profits, recreation, stability, social and cultural, and protected species objectives, like Peter was just talking about, and also with some seabirds. And so it isn't just fish and exploiting the fish, but it is trying to look at the big picture of these objectives. So the first portion of the report is a graphical summary. The first page, and I'll show you these, is a report card with status relative to the objectives. The second page is some summary bullets of risks to meeting those management objectives. And the third page tries to get at some big picture ecosystem themes. And then the rest of the report is these two main sections of performance relative to management objectives and risks to meeting those. And I'll illustrate those, but will not be able to go into detail in this talk. So here's the summary pages. And as you can see on the first page, what we're doing here is we're showing the different objectives like seafood production. What is the trend? It's currently down. The current status is below the long-term average, and the implications of this for fishery management. And what we've tried to do is structure it so all of the objectives are treated in that way in the summary. And then the second page is the risks to meeting those fishery management objectives in two major categories: climate change, a big one that we've just been hearing about, and also other ocean uses, offshore wind development in particular. And so it's not that there aren't benefits to offshore wind development, but this is focusing on the risks to meeting fishery management objectives in this report. And in each of these, the main idea is to go in and give not just what is the indicator, but what does the indicator mean for the managers to the best of our ability. So the synthesis themes that we have here are also a way to build out this report and connect the indicators across the report. And the main one that we emphasized this year was multiple system drivers. So it isn't just one thing that drives, say, the right whale trajectory. There's probably a lot of different things in there that are interacting. And how can we illustrate those for managers and help to figure out how they can navigate actions that are based on these multiple drivers. Also, there are regime shifts and ecosystem reorganization that can be really important to think about. And to the extent that we can identify those for managers, that is what we want to do with this report. We are not quite there yet, but that's the plan for the next iterations of the report. The basic idea being you can be in one sort of stable regime in your system, whether that's with the species or with how the fisheries are operating or something. And then a whole bunch of things might change at once to push that system into a different regime here. After you've crossed this critical threshold, it may be very difficult to get back to the previous regime, no matter what you do. And so you're just going to adapt to it. But the idea is to identify where those thresholds are and maybe see if we can keep us from inadvertently going into a new regime if we possibly had control over it. So this links to the risk assessment that the Mid-Atlantic Council is doing, in that the indicators that we would show in the report, like this one for total revenue, translate into risk levels in the Mid-Atlantic Council's risk assessment. So for instance, the Mid-Atlantic Council has identified a risk level of moderate to high if there's a significant long-term revenue decrease, and that is what we're seeing in this line here, the red line, with the revenue from Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council species. So that translates from the State of the Ecosystem report into the risk element commercial revenue, which was flagged as moderate to high risk, but unchanged from last year. So for the remainder of the quick talk here, I'm going to give you an overview of how we've put this together this year. So the first example for performance relative to fishery management objectives is the seafood production objective. So as I said before, the indicators here are showing that seafood production is trending down, both in commercial and recreational landings. And what we tried to do is go through and see what some of the multiple drivers might be. So this would include ecosystem or stock production, management, market conditions, environment, a whole bunch of things are behind trends in landings. And so we just tried to illustrate as many as we could, but again, there will be more added as we evolve the report. So first of all, are there trends in biomass that might be driving this? The short answer is no. You can see these biomass trends are flat. Another indicator that we introduced for this year is there ecosystem overfishing? And so these are experimental indicators that we're looking at, but the short answer again is no, not right now. We're down in the green zone in both of these at the moment for our landings, total landings from the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And is there individual stock overfishing is a question the councils deal with all the time. Well, we know that there's a couple of stocks here that are not doing what they're supposed to do, but most of them are fine. So the main answer is the drivers turn out to be probably market dynamics, but this is something we can work on more. And the key messages of the report are to monitor the climate risks for these species, especially surf clams and ocean quahogs that are sensitive to climate, and figure out different changes in ecosystem composition, production, and fishing engagement. So the last example is the risks to meeting fishery management objectives. And again, I'm not going to go into detail here, but new indicators such as development timeline, revenue in the lease areas, and survey overlap were presented in the report. And the implications were also spelled out to the extent possible for fishery managers, which again, I will not go through here, but just if you want to see the full reports, they are linked at the end. And so the risk assessment is a summary here that the fishery managers get of all of this so that they can see in one place where their highest risks are. And this is updated annually. I just want to quickly thank all the contributors. There are many, over 50 to the reports, and leave you with some references where you can get additional information. So thanks very much for inviting me again.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I was reviewing the reports last week, and there's just so much valuable information packed into a really easy to digest format. So it's a great resource, and we'll make sure that the slides get linked online after we wrap up the forum. So next up, we have Chris McGuire, who is the Marine Program Director for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. So Chris and his team have developed an offshore marine mapping tool to help stakeholders along the Atlantic coast access and interpret the volumes of data available for marine species and habitats. So Chris, we will look forward to hearing about your favorite shoes and then a little bit more about your project. Let's see, we can't hear you. Not yet.
Can you see?
There you go.
Can you see my full screen now?
We can. Looks good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Excellent. Well, thanks, Megan and Sarah. So I'm Chris McGuire from the Nature Conservancy, and I'm coming to you today from my home on Cape Cod. Actually, Sarah and I should have carpooled because we're sort of neighbors. And here on Cape Cod, we wait all year for flip-flop weather, and I'm happy to report that it's almost here. So that's the shoe story for me. Today, I'm going to give you all a sneak peek at a new spatial data management tool that we're developing and expect to release publicly in mid-July. As a science-based conservation organization, the Nature Conservancy is focused on using the best available science to inform natural resource decisions. We live in a pretty data-rich region, but sometimes it can be difficult to query all the different pieces of information. And now, as we look at the development of offshore wind and other uses of our ocean, we see that project review timelines are short. The pace of project development is rapidly accelerating. So we set out to develop a decision support tool that could make it easier for agencies and stakeholders to understand what the life underwater in an area of interest really looks like. In the first session, we heard from Malin and others that making the data and the trends over time more accessible was important, and that's what this tool is all about. So our area of interest here is really the footprint of wind development right now, which is basically from the Carolinas to Maine. And this tool has really been worked on and developed by a team of data scientists at the Nature Conservancy, really led by Dr. Martha Ribera, who unfortunately was unavailable today. And we also amassed a terrific steering committee made up of TNC staff and state agency and regional experts from across the project footprint, including probably some folks who are on the call today. So thanks to you guys for your guidance and feedback in developing this tool. I think most of the attendees at this meeting are pretty interested in using the best data for making decisions, but how do we actually do that? In the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, we've built these incredible data portals that house the best available peer-reviewed data, which is great, a tremendous resource. We know that offshore project decisions are made through environmental assessments and consultations. But it turns out that that part in the middle there of getting those good data to those environmental assessments is a little bit tricky. It's sort of like healthcare. Who knew it was so complicated? So really we need to put some of the information in context. And when we say context, we think about it sort of at 3 levels. So, how does the area that we're interested in compare to the rest of the region? What are the trends over time? Are we seeing changes, changes over time in species distribution or habitats? And then how is a proposed project likely to impact these natural resources? We have actually sort of the least data about this one, but it's still something that we're working on bringing in. So again, we're trying to go from single species information to a broader picture of the site. Let's just jump right in and check out the tool. A live demo always seems a little risky for a presentation like this, so I'm just going to share some screenshots of what the tool looks like. We're in the beta phase now and plan a release in July. Here's the splash screen, and the first step that the user takes is to select an area of interest, either by drawing a polygon, importing a polygon, or selecting a pre-selected area of interest like a wind lease area or a planning area. So for this example, I selected the Hudson South wind area in the New York Bight. So, this is my area of interest that we're looking at and that the tool is feeding information about. And so what we get right away is this kind of first screen that is designed to draw your attention to the significant marine features in the area of interest. And we have it separated by benthic and pelagic information. And we can click on any of these to dive in. I'll just show a few. So first, for each section, there's an extensive description about the source data that's used and how the layers were created. In this case, the bars are showing the sampling density in the area of interest. So for example, it shows that there have been 19 fall trawl survey tows completed in this area over time. And there's information about each of the pieces of data, and there's a lot of metadata and stuff you can see. For each of the data sources, you can actually pop up another menu which will have some sort of frequently asked questions and gives you links to journal articles and primary source materials to really describe extensively how the tool was built. This is really important to build confidence in the data that we're looking at. So if we look at benthic structure and characteristics, this will show you some characteristics at the site. This tool will do quantitative analysis for several of these features. So you can see on the screen where it shows sediment type. So what it's showing you there is the different sediment types in the area of interest. And I hovered my mouse over the circle and it pops up that larger bar shows that a majority of that site is sand. And you won't be surprised to learn that the other ones are sort of sand with mud and sand with gravel. This also shows you seabed forms, which is like slope and depression. And in this case, it's 71% low flat. So this is a pretty flat sandy area, good for wind construction. I can also toggle on the sediment data itself, and it'll show me the whole regional map. And this is coming straight from the data portals that is underlying any of these descriptions. So now if we look at some fish data, So here we've selected, we're looking at fish data, which is seasonal because of the trawl survey. So we have fall or spring or a combination. So this is all the fish data from the spring for demersal fish in particular. And it shows you the persistent abundance over time in the trawl survey. And so for any of these species, I can click on one of them. So in this case, I've clicked on summer flounder, and by hovering my mouse over it, tells me that 85% of the area is high abundance of summer flounder, and the balance is very high abundance. And then you can see the underlying map again directly from the data portal. So if you're thinking about going fluke fishing right now, looks like it's going to be a long ride. They're pretty far offshore still. We can also look at the historical record and begin to understand the changes in abundance over time. So here we've been to trawl survey data by decade, and we can see that in this area, there's a general increase in elasmobranchs like skates and dogfish. You can see, sort of the colors getting hotter as you go from the 70s to current. And then there's actually a general decrease in the abundance of gattids like hake and cod. And then down the page, you can see, not much trend for flounders, and it looks like spotted hake is kind of bucking the trend here. Looking at another sort of species group, this is marine mammals. At the first screen, you also get these sort of dials that show you the relative abundance compared to the region. And so for this area, the region is like the whole mid-Atlantic. And this would show you that for marine mammals, this is an above average location for abundance. And for marine mammals that are sensitive to low frequency noise, like pile driving as an example, it's a really, it's a more important area for them, 2 standard deviations above the mean in this particular case. These data are based on models that were created by the team at Duke University. And so we can see by hovering over one species like humpback whales that this is an important area for humpback whales. And again, by clicking on it, you show the underlying portal data. And then it's a little hard to see, but there are some green dots on here, which are aerial and ship survey data from the last decade, which were recently compiled by TNC. So one last slide here. So there are a lot of tools out there, and so I thought it might be useful to give a little comparison. I think we're familiar with the data portals and the marine cadastre, which both allow visual exploration of individual layers and overlayment of those layers using transparency. The data portals have the best regional data. The marine cadastre has the best national data. Folks might also be familiar with the ocean reports tool, which is a really great tool, which, similar to this mapping tool, allows the user to select a particular area and explores those areas quantitatively. The ocean reports tool is using, again, the national data from the marine cadastre, and TNC's mapping tool that I'm speaking about today uses the regional data from the data portals. And it also provides interpretation compared to ecoregion, shows trends over time, and in this case is focused specifically on marine life and habitat data. So that's sort of a whirlwind tour, and I'll leave you with some whirling wind turbines. Look for a release of this tool coming out in July. And thanks very much, and I'll look forward to some questions.
You're muted, Megan.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Chris. As someone who works a lot on tools and data, it's really interesting to see these new tools coming up, and great to see the data being shared underneath across all the different tools. So we're gonna move into our last presentation for this session. Last but not least, we have Mimi Diorio. Mimi is a data manager for the NOAA Marine Protected Area, and she gets an extra thanks today because she's joining us from California. So she should still be in her PJs drinking coffee, but she's here today to talk to us about the administration's new 30 by 30 conservation target and about data and tools that can help inform that. So Mimi, tell us about your shoes and about your project.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for the invitation and for the opportunity to share with this this group today. I've learned a lot, and I think it comes great after that TNC presentation, the work that I'm going to share. These are my fish flops. I chose these obviously for the crowd. Also, living in California, I don't really wear shoes as much as possible, but when I do, I want them to be funny and light and comfortable. And I will also just say, and trying to think why these shoes, I think that life has been throwing us some curveballs. So trying to keep things light and humorous is important. And these shoes are definitely a conversation piece every time we wear them. So anyway, again, thanks for the opportunity. My world has lately been focused a lot on the 30 by 30 initiative. If you don't know about it, you will soon. And I will also say that today is kind of a big day for 30 by 30 and that the report from the White House is due to be released today that will give us a lot more information on what 30 by 30 means to us and how we're going to approach it. I've created a story map today, so I can share the link after. It includes the links to the data and the story that I'm telling, and I've really tried to keep it concise because I think a lot of the information that gets imparted is better through the Q&A. So I will keep it short and sweet, and hopefully the dialogue that ensues will get at any potential questions that evolve. So 30 by 30, in January, the new administration put out an executive order about focusing on tackling climate that included this initiative to commitment to protect 30% of our lands and waters in US by 2030. It's a number, 30%. I think folks in policy and often folks who are writing the language of the EOs and whatnot just think, okay, it's a statistic. As most of the people on this call know, the devil is in the details when it comes to statistics. And as the lead for the MPA Center on managing information on marine protected areas in US waters, understanding what goes into the statistic is very challenging. And it's really important that we have a good handle on that before we start to try to unravel what gets counted in these important statistics. I've included a link here to the EO. There's a lot more in there than just the 30 by 30, but it does provide a vision for how the White House is looking towards tackling climate. And this is just one small piece, the 30 by 30 part. As I mentioned, my role is about compiling and analyzing data on marine protected areas in US waters, but it also means I work with a lot of geospatial data. I've worn many different hats, working with Megan and others across NOAA on ocean planning. This stack of data here, I've used this in various different ways throughout my career. However, the point today is about how we understand area-based management. And that speaks to 30 by 30 because the 30 by 30 call is not about marine protected areas. It's about areas that contribute to conservation on land and water. And as you can imagine, that word conservation can be interpreted in various different ways. And there's a lot of controversy on what should be included. And I think the challenge comes that there's a lot of ways that we're protecting ocean space. And the boundaries that we have overlap. There's various different jurisdictions and governance authorities that are acting often in the same place. So understanding this complexity is really important if we want to start to get a better sense of what we're conserving and where we have conservation opportunities and what areas are actually contributing the most to conservation potential. So this story map, what I'm doing here is bringing together a variety of different data layers that we've compiled either individually or with partnerships that help us to understand this complexity. I will just say we haven't cracked the nut, but I'm presenting the nut and putting it out there as the data resources we have available and how we're starting to sort of circle this question to get a better understanding of what should go into the dialogue of 30 by 30 and how we will start to define criteria for what should be included and how we will classify space in the ocean based on conservation potential. So, so maps, I'm a GIS person. I work with maps and data and I consider myself a NOAA data ambassador. I like to not just create data, but push it, make it accessible and discoverable in various different ways and tell stories about it. So I will highlight some of the data layers that we are working with and what they can tell us and hopefully a little bit about what they can't as well. So MPAs, as I mentioned, is a big part of what I do. Our database, that's the NOAA MPA inventory, is designed to catalog marine protected areas that meet the international IUCN definition of marine protected area. It's listed here. And really, so we get an understand on conservation and marine protected area targets, and understand how much area we have protected in what is considered an MPA. Currently, that number is 26. There's been a lot of numbers bantered about in the past, 6 months since the EO came out. I guess 4 or 5 months actually, but it's 26% of US waters are in a marine protected area that meets the IUCN definition. And if you can look at this map, first you'll notice that we include land in our visualization, but we only include marine in our statistics, and that most of the area that's in an MPA is over here in the Pacific. So 98% of the protected area is in the Pacific region. Also, we look at not just where we have it, but how well that area protects ocean space. And it's another important statistic that we're asked often is how much is in a marine reserve. And that currently equates to 3% and is mainly focused, here, I'll show you here, prohibiting all extractive uses is the small area around Papahanaumokuakea and a number of state reserves and areas of wildlife refuges in the Pacific that calculate to the 3% marine reserve. We're also asked other questions about how much area is prohibited to commercial fishing. And again, this number speaks to the areas within an MPA that is prohibiting commercial fishing, but that's not to say there aren't other areas. We'll talk about in a little bit, de facto marine protected areas, fishery management areas that either highly restrict or prohibit commercial fishing. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of nuance to how these categories are defined. So the picture of MPAs is, you can see where it pops out. We have things going on all over the US, but a lot of the area is in the Pacific. I have also included links here for the data and how to access and download either as services or downloadable GIS to all these different data resources. So what comes next is the real complexity, which is fishery management. And again, this has really risen to the top for the dialogue of 30 by 30 is that there are lots of areas in US waters that aren't MPAs that contribute significantly to conservation. And how do we draw the line? How do we draw the line between many fishery management areas, which there are thousands, and as you note by this map, they covered all of the EEZ, and they overlap significantly in places. There are some areas, I'm gonna just take a stab over here, see if it'll work for me. 13 overlapping fishery management areas in this spot. So you can imagine that as a mariner, trying to understand the regulations is one thing, and then as a marine planner, trying to understand this fabric of seascape regulations is a whole nother. So while it's important that we have the data and the boundaries, what I'd like to impart today as I continue my presentation is not just the boundaries, but beyond the boundaries, understanding what these cumulative boundaries contribute potentially to conservation and how we can unpack that and use that to help inform 30 by 30. So this data resource, there's various different ones here. I really just want to speak to the fact that there's a lot of different ways that we're protecting ocean space through fisheries. We have essential fish habitat with fishing regulations. We also have just essential fish habitat, which is important areas for fish. We have habitat areas of particular concern. It will take a second to load, some of which have regulations as well, some of which don't or may. And then again, this complex fabric of overlapping jurisdictions and regulations related to fishery management. And these are all, another challenge is these are imparted by state, these are regional, we have some that are national in scope, and so how the data are managed and how the information are tracked is not consistent. And we're working towards a little bit more consistency with that, especially between now and 2030. So fishery management poses an interesting challenge. And what the MPA Center, who I work for, has done in recent years is work in public partnership with a group called the Anthropocene Institute on what we call the Protected Seas Database. And the majority of the rest of this conversation will be about this database, which is, again, this public-private partnership that is designed to look at the breadth of different management areas that restrict extraction in US waters. It gets down to the how regulations combine to tell a story about place-based management. I see Megan there, so that means I don't have much time. So I will zoom through this. Protected seas, gives you this comprehensive picture of area-based management. And there's also lots of areas that are closed for military and other purposes that are considered MPAs, but that also add to that picture. What I'd like to do now is to just say quickly, this last piece is beyond the boundaries. So polygons are important, but what really matters is cumulatively what's happening in the ocean space. So I like to call this the beyond the boundaries piece of the research, which actually takes a grid-based approach to the protected seas database and drills down to see not just where we have protected areas and managed areas, but what the cumulative regulations are in that place. And if you can see here, clicking on an area will give you all the 15 protected areas that are managed in this one location, which is an interesting piece of the story. But when you look at overlap and gear types, what we can also learn when you click on some of these places is not just that it's protected with 15 different managed areas, or actually we can tell you exactly how there's 16 MMAs or managed areas in this location, but actually that there are 8 gears prohibited. So it will give you a more comprehensive picture on how well this piece of ocean is managed, and not by the boundaries, but by the cumulative nature of the regulations and jurisdictions that are in place in that particular location. So all these data and tools are available as web services and downloadable GIS. And I think the main message I want to make is that it's complex and it's constantly changing, and understanding is not just about geospatial data, but what that actually contributes to place-based conservation and conservation potential. So, ta-da! Thanks for your time. I welcome any questions you might have.
Thanks, Mimi. And I remember to unmute myself this time, thankfully. And I hope that next time I get to see you in person, you'll wear your fish shoes. So thanks to all of our presenters today. I think they all identified different ways we can synthesize and pull together information to look at things in a different way. So I would invite everyone to turn back on their cameras. And for the audience, if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat box. We do have one question to get started. What's the biggest data gap that you see in the ocean space? I don't know, Mimi, do you maybe want to start with that one?
Well, I'll just say that we've been working on with others internationally, actually, on this marine biodiversity gap analysis. And I will say that it's not a gap, it's a data consistency. We don't have national, and especially not global, but definitely not national scale data on habitats and consistency on what should be included in a biodiversity assessment. And so we often are just postage stamps, and then we come up with this incomplete picture, and the stakeholders say, well, that can't be right because you're missing X, Y, and Z. So I would say what's missing is this comprehensive stakeholder engaged process to understand what should be considered as biodiversity and how we should map it and integrate existing data layers so that when we do tell a story, we have the buy-in that we've done the best that we can with the resources available.
Excellent.
Big goal.
Chris or Sarah, you want to
shoot for the stars?
I really like what Mimi just said, because my answer to that wasn't that I can't really tell you what piece of data we need, but we need more of the synthesis. We need more understanding of how the pieces fit together. And so the 2 tools we just saw are really excellent and can help get us there. And I think especially the stakeholder piece that Mimi just mentioned, that getting other people involved in using those tools is how we're going to improve them. And that's what we found with building the State of the Ecosystem report too, is it's the iterative, going back and forth with the council and saying, is this what you want? Well, not really. We actually want this other thing, or can you add this? That's where it's, I think, getting more valuable for them, hopefully, but also we're learning what they need to do their job and how we can put that together. And so the biggest challenge is bringing the data together and making it accessible, which I think was a point made in the previous session too.
Yeah, and just to add, in the whole, Northeast region, we are so fortunate to have this amazing trawl survey data that it kind of makes other things seem data poor. So just as an example,
looking at marine mammal data or avian, bird, and bat data, we mostly use modeled data layers because we just don't have enough samples to really show the data like we show for fisheries. So, it's a huge lift to improve that. It's hard to compete with a 50-year consistent survey, but that's that's one of the places where there's like an actual data difference and it's mostly because our data is so awesome for fisheries, and it's hard to compete. The ocean is a hard place to sample.
All right. Let's see, I have a question here that maybe brings in Sarah and Malin from our previous panel. So somebody says they're a fan of the State of the Ecosystem reports and ecosystem-based fisheries management, but concerned that the work may mask the limitations and biases of the fisheries management and government regimes. Actually, that may be Peter and Malin. So how can the State of the Ecosystem reports be expanded to inform and take into consideration the broader fisheries and conservation offshore wind multiple use points that Malin discussed? I don't know, Sarah, if you want to start there and we can let Malin and Peter jump in.
Sure, I can try. And we do want to bring in all of those pieces. So we did have that whole expanded wind section this year. We did have a focus on climate change and what that means in terms of risks for fishery management. It's just really a beginning. And there's no way we can include all the information we want to, because the other goal of this report is that it stay less than 40 pages, and we're already kind of pushing that limit because we don't want to write an encyclopedia, but we do want to include everything that the council might need in thinking about their decision process. So what we're actually trying to do is have more online resources, have more resources that are maybe a deeper technical dive, not in the report itself, but for council staff to use when they're doing analyses, etc. Obviously, it's a work in progress though, and we're not there yet, and it's going to take a long time. So I think we welcome further commentary on how to do this better. And I'll stop there and listen to other people.
Anything to add, Malin?
I mean, I know Sarah and the team are working on a bunch of things already, and I think that the framework that's already been set up is really helpful, right? It's not just about fisheries, but it's sort of these broader provisioning services as well as supporting services. So I feel like that framework allows for a lot more information to be included. I think from the scientific side, one of the things that we're actually still working on is providing the kind of forward-looking information at the sort of 1 to 10 or even 20-year timescales that are especially useful from a fisheries management perspective, realizing that that's the sort of the decision-making audience for the State of the Ecosystem reports. But I think that's maybe where we're trying to move. I mean, it's both an oceanographic challenge, but also some really important ecological challenges as well of how we make appropriate forecasts over those timescales.
And if I could just add from the management side, the councils recognize that the council system has a lot of lag and is challenging to keep up with change. And so all of the East Coast councils have just agreed to start doing something called scenario planning, which is in essence a way of looking at how management can adapt to trends. So I think that the science that was presented here today is ahead of management right now, and scenario planning is designed, and this is being conducted by the South Atlantic, Mid-Atlantic, New England, and ASMFC together to really begin to have a process to understand how could you evolve management in order to take advantage of the science and the tools that are forecasting in a way that we've really never used forecasting before. This is about changing species distribution and all sorts of other things. So I think it's a really, I think that's a really great thing that the councils are just embarking on, and I think we'll see that play out over the next year and a half.
Excellent. Excellent. Let's see. Chris, this is a sort of specific question for you. How do you specify an area of interest in the tool that you've developed?
Yeah, so the area of interest is user selected. That's just our term. So you can just go in and draw a box, and that's your area of interest. You could, if you're a GIS expert like Mimi, you can import a polygon, or you can, there's a drop-down menu for the wind energy areas and lease sites. So you can, that's what I did in the case of the example, is I just used the drop-down and selected one of those areas. But it's actually pretty cool to just draw your own box, and you can move it around the ocean, and it just updates really fast. The tool is, the speed of tools, which Mimi can attest to, is like amazing these days. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. So Mimi, we have a question about where the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council deep sea coral protection areas fit within the MPA hierarchy.
Certainly, that's a pretty loaded question. They are in they're in our fishery management area database, and they are currently not considered an MPA. They were previously in our MPA inventory as a sustainable production classification, which basically meant fishery management areas in the inventory. But in recent years, because of the international guidelines and the international definition, we've moved fishery management areas for the most part completely out of the MPA inventory. And they're now being considered under a new definition set by CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, under a definition called other effective conservation measures, which is going to be part of what gets included in targets. MPAs and OECMs will be the numbers used to deliver statistics towards conservation-based targets. And I think I could talk about this forever, but what needs to happen next with respect to 30 by 30 is taking all of the conservation contributing areas and start to rank and rate how they contribute and what their potential conservation is. And I think the challenge with these definitions is that it's not about effectiveness and outcome, it's about intent. And so areas that are defined for fishery management don't meet the IUCN definition because your primary intent has to be on biodiversity conservation first. And so, and there's challenge in that. So this is where I was getting at, that the criteria of lumping and splitting these needs to be a lot more fleshed out. And coming up with statistics or 30%, we need to understand how we get there with definitions and categories and classifications.
Excellent. And let's see, maybe just one last question here to close out our panel, and this is for all the speakers. What information on climate change and variability do you wish you had? And what would be helpful for building climate resilience into decision making? Let's see, Chris, you want to get started? You want to pass?
I'll let Sarah get started.
Thanks. I think, reflecting on what Malin said, I think for us, having these more short to midterm projections of some of our climate indicators would be really helpful for the fishery management councils. Right now, the report is sort of historical and then saying, hey, what we're seeing up until now has been a big change. But right now, we can't tell you what next year looks like, and that's where they're making their decisions. So I think that would be incredibly useful. I know a lot of people are working on that.
Mimi, any thoughts from you?
Was that to me?
Yeah.
That's a big question. You know, it's definitely not my area of expertise. I will just say that we've got a lot of people asking that and working on those big questions. And I think we're, especially with this executive order, putting it forth to all the federal agencies and partners. There's likely to be a lot more action and not just discussion on this topic at the government level in the near term.
Yeah, and I'll just say I agree with Sarah. I think that the downscaling of projections is so important, because if people just can't think about what's going to happen 50 or 70 years from now, I think, you know, one of the challenges with addressing climate change in general is that people can't think at that time scale. And so by as our models improve, that downscaling is really useful for the councils to be able to think about something that they can actually get a hold of, or that any other users can get a hold of. So I agree with that. It's a good answer. That's why I wanted Terry to go first.
Yeah, I think we've heard a couple times throughout this week that the idea of future projections is sort of a way we need to move into the future, having trends and projections in terms of data. And, you know, Chris and Mimi being kind of data analysts and GIS folks, we haven't done a lot of that in our spatial data tools. So it'll be interesting to see how we integrate that in the future into our tools. I am going to pass it over to Jessica to introduce our final part of our discussion today, which is a video.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. So our last presentation is going to bring you an international perspective. It was submitted by video because it's, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning on May 7th in Australia right now. So they should all be asleep in their pajamas. But Dr. David Wachenfeld is the chief scientist at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and he submitted this video for us. So please enjoy hearing their perspectives on managing for resilience in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. David Wachenfeld and I am the Chief Scientist at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority here in Townsville, Australia. The organisers of this session have asked each of the speakers to put a photo of their favourite pair of shoes on their title slide. I've decided to take it one step further and actually wear my favourite pair of shoes while I'm introducing myself. These are my favourite pair of shoes because that's what I wear when I'm exploring the Great Barrier Reef. Many thanks to the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean for the opportunity to talk to you today about how we build the resilience of the Great Barrier Reef to impacts from climate change through our management of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Many thanks again to Mako for the opportunity to talk to you today about how we manage the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in order to maintain resilience in the face of climate change. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are the traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef and who have an enduring spiritual and cultural connection to the reef that goes back tens of thousands of years. I'd also like to acknowledge First Nations people throughout the world. On this map, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is the yellow shaded area along the northeast coast of Australia. And the first thing I would like to emphasize is the enormous size of this marine park. It's bigger than 2/3 of the countries on the planet at about 1,500 miles long and 133,000 square miles in area. It is also home to many thousands of species of fish, sharks, seabirds, whales, dolphins, but also many, many species of invertebrates. So it's a very diverse area. I do want to emphasize that the Great Barrier Reef is much more than just corals. So yes, there are about 3,000 coral reefs, but we also have very extensive areas of other habitats, including seagrasses, mangrove forests, algal and sponge meadows, but also large areas of continental slopes, so very deep waters up to about 4,000 meters deep, as well as more than 900 islands. I'm going to talk for a little while about some of the problems we have on the Great Barrier Reef, but the first thing I want to emphasize is that those problems have been in development for about 200 years. Although many people think of the reef as one of the most highly protected areas in the world, and today that's true, there is a long history of overexploitation of sharks, of dugongs, of turtles, and yes, we used to export turtle soup from Great Barrier Reef turtles, as well as unsustainable development of the catchment for urban, industrial, and agricultural purposes. These days we identify 4 major threats on the Great Barrier Reef, and the 2 things I really want to emphasize first is that climate change is by far the greatest and fastest growing of those threats, and only the bottom one, some remaining impacts of fishing activities, are directly dealable with marine park management. The others cause impacts in the Great Barrier Reef, but they come from activities outside of the marine park. And so as marine park managers, we have to work carefully with other partners to deliver outcomes in the marine park. When I speak of climate change, it's not just theory. I'm sure you all realize that climate change is here and with us now. Over the last 20 years, in 16 of those, there have been one type of extreme weather event or another that has affected the Great Barrier Reef, and in particular the marine heat waves of 2016, 2017 and 2020 had very great impacts, particularly to corals and coral reefs. And so, not surprisingly, increasingly, the reef is under pressure and areas of the reef are damaged. This is a typical area that's been impacted by bleaching. This is typical moderate damage from a cyclone. We still have ongoing issues with the coral predator, the crown of thorns starfish, and so we have areas that have been damaged by that. But remembering the enormous size of the Great Barrier Reef, we still also have many areas of coral reef that look like this. They're vibrant, they're healthy, they've got great coral communities, fish communities, and everything that goes with a healthy coral reef. Again, I want to emphasize that the Great Barrier Reef is about much more than just corals and coral reefs. So in the period between 2009 to about 2012, we had a whole series of years with record-breaking floods and severe cyclones. There was great pollution to the inshore environment. We saw both from the turbidity from the floods and the direct physical disturbance of the cyclones that most of our inshore seagrass beds were pretty severely degraded. And as a consequence, dugong and green turtles, which primarily feed on seagrass, were stranded in higher numbers than ever before. And in particular, 2012, we saw numbers of animals stranded, starved, that were double the previous record for strandings. And so climate-related impacts are about much more than just coral reefs. Indeed, in 2007, we published a vulnerability assessment across the entire Great Barrier Reef ecosystem, and found that the vast majority of elements had moderate or high vulnerability to climate change, and importantly, so do human communities and industries that depend upon the reef. So, what does the future of the reef look like? As we move forward in time, to see that the condition of the reef is declining, though, as I said, much of it is still in good health. And obviously, our job is to try to deliver the upper of those two green trajectories for the future and avoid the lower trajectory where the system crosses some sort of ecological threshold and remains in a long-term degraded condition. Now, there are two things that are going to determine which of those trajectories we follow. Fairly obviously, the rate and magnitude of future climate change is absolutely critical. But so is where is that resilience threshold below which the system collapses and ceases to have the ability to recover. Now, we know from experience both on the Great Barrier Reef and in other places that a whole range of activities such as protecting biodiversity, improving water quality, having sustainable coastal development and fishing, and in the case of corals and reefs, controlling crown of thorns starfish, can all boost the resilience of the system and give it a better chance of surviving in the face of impacts from climate change. Now, just to emphasize very strongly, these are not alternatives. Strong mitigation of climate change and increasing the resilience of the system are strategies that have to go hand in hand. If we boil this down, the climate change piece is all about strong implementation of the Paris Agreement, and in terms of our local resilience measures, we have a plan called the Reef 2050 plan that covers all of those issues that were listed there before, and I will talk about that more in just a minute. Because climate change is such a huge issue for the reef, educating people about climate change and its impacts on the reef is absolutely critical. We use this diagram a great deal because it illustrates that although the Paris Agreement is fabulous, in the sense that it has committed us to maintaining temperatures rise well below 2 degrees centigrade, preferably to 1.5, and we have made some progress in that direction. In other words, prior to the Paris Agreement, we were following the red trajectory at the top, but even the nationally determined contributions of all the signatories to the Paris Agreement have only brought us down into that yellow trajectory. We still have a very long way to go to get to the blue and green trajectories that will give a much safer future for reefs. And so we put a lot of effort into education about this. In particular, we have a climate change position statement where we clearly state that only the strongest and fastest possible actions to decrease global greenhouse gas emissions will reduce the risks and limit the impacts of climate change on the reef. In terms of what we're doing locally, the Great Barrier Reef is managed collaboratively by different parts of the Australian government together with the state government of Queensland. And all of that work is brought together in the Reef 2050 long-term sustainability plan. Now, this is a very holistic plan. It includes our management of the marine park, it includes fisheries management, and management on the catchment to reduce pollution into the park in one overarching framework. I'm only going to talk about a few of the things that we specifically do in managing the marine park. The foundation of what we do is our zoning plan, which is depicted there on the left. And then there is an activities guide on the right, which allows people to see which activities they are allowed to do with or without a permit in different zones. Now, the critical thing here is that 33% of the marine park is in no-take areas, but I think more importantly than that, at least 20% of each of 70 different bioregions is also in no-take areas. In other words, this zoning plan is comprehensive, adequate, and representative. And although it is now more than 15 years old, it still has very strong scientific evidence for its effectiveness and is generally held up as a best case example of marine spatial planning. Now, this zoning plan did not specifically have resilience to climate change as part of its intent, but as we developed it and as we understood the growing impacts of climate change, that has become part of how we believe that the zoning plan is contributing to the resilience of the park. And of course, it's no good just having colors on a map. It's essential that we have very strong education, surveillance, and enforcement activities out in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. As I said, this is an endeavour that is run jointly by the national Australian government and the state Queensland government, and there is a whole range of educational activities as well as quite hard-nosed enforcement to make sure that that zoning plan and the other marine park regulations are followed. Another critical element of our management of the marine park is controlling crown of thorns starfish. We are thinking that in the long term, the control of the starfish is more about controlling predator removal through fishing and pollution consequences. But in the short term, we actually need to get on with the job of protecting coral. And so we have a pretty comprehensive and successful crown of thorns starfish control program. We are never going to be able to eradicate every crown of thorns on the Great Barrier Reef. This is a program that is about strategically selecting economically and ecologically important reefs and making sure that we control the starfish on those reefs to protect coral populations. The last part of marine park management I wanted to talk about was what does the future look like? We're engaged in a very comprehensive 150 million Australian dollar R&D program called the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. This is looking at a whole variety of ways of taking existing restoration and intervention tools for reefs and scaling them up to be cost effective. Now, this is an enormous challenge, but this is a very well-resourced R&D initiative. And of course, we're hopeful that if we are successful in scaling up some of the techniques for the Great Barrier Reef, those endeavors may well be applicable to other coral reef areas as well. I want to wrap up by emphasizing that although the Great Barrier Reef is under significant pressure, particularly from climate change, it remains a critical part of the Australian national identity. It remains a part of the spiritual and cultural identity of our First Nations people, Australian Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. It remains an international environmental icon. It's recognised as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world and a World Heritage Area. It's an economic powerhouse, generating tens of thousands of jobs and billions of Australian dollars in economy every year. And of course, it's internationally recognised as the home of Nemo and his friends and family. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you, and I wish you well for the rest of the forum.